The ocean remembers things. The land has forgotten, not in the way humans remember, with effort, with intention, with the deliberate act of holding something in mind. The ocean remembers the way stone remembers pressure, the way water remembers the shape of what it once flowed around. Memory without consciousness, memory as simple presence. Tonight we return to that presence, to the dark water, to the rhythm that continues whether we listen or not, to the patient surface that covers more than it reveals, and in covering preserves what time on land would have erased long ago. We have been here before, not to this exact place, perhaps, but to this state, this stillness, this point where the solid world we know gives way to something older, deeper, less defined, where certainty dissolves into the gentle current of maybe, of perhaps, of stories that exist in the space between what was and what we think we remember. We came here searching for Atlantis. We found not a place, but a feeling, not ruins, but rhythm, not answers, but the peace that comes from learning to hold questions without needing them resolved. And now we return, not to the same story, but to the same water, because the ocean holds more than one lost place, more than one disappeared shore, more than one memory of land that once stood where now there is only the slow rise and fall of waves. The night is darker here, or perhaps we have simply drifted further from the places where light reaches easily, further from the coastlines humans know and name and mark on charts, out into the vastness where maps grow vague and distances lose meaning, and the water becomes indistinguishable from sky, except for the slight difference in the way each holds darkness. This is where the older stories live, the ones that predate Atlantis, the ones that speak of times so ancient that even the word ancient feels inadequate. Times when the world was arranged differently, when the continents had not yet settled into their current positions, when the ocean was not divided into named seas, but was simply one vast body holding everything. There is a name that surfaces in this darkness, not shouted, not proclaimed, but whispered, passed mouth to ear across centuries and oceans and cultures that should have had no contact with each other, but somehow carried the same word, the same memory, the same sense of something that existed before the world broke into the pieces we recognize now. Lemuria. The name arrives like mist, soft, unclear, easily dismissed as imagination or projection, or the human tendency to create patterns where none exist, but persistent, returning again and again in stories told by people who had no reason to tell the same story unless something, some memory, some echo, some truth too old to verify was moving through them. Lemuria is not Atlantis. It does not arrive with the clarity of rings and temples. It does not promise the organized abundance of a city designed to last. It offers no golden walls or carefully carved channels or laws inscribed on pillars. Lemuria is older than that, quieter than that. It exists, if it ever existed, in a time before humans built monuments, before civilization meant cities, before culture required stone. It exists as a feeling more than a fact. The feeling of land that stretched across distance is now impossible, of shores that connected what is now separated, of a world where the ocean had not yet claimed its full territory, and the earth was still deciding where solid would end and liquid would begin. We cannot see Lemuria, not even in memory, because no one alive has a memory that reaches back that far. We can only sense it, the way you sense something just beyond the edge of vision, the way you know, sometimes, that you are not alone in a dark room, even though you cannot see, shares the space with you. Lemuria is that presence, ancient, vast, dissolved so completely to ocean, that even searching for it feels like searching for water in water, impossible to locate because it has become indistinguishable from what covers it. But the ocean remembers in its currents, in its depths, in the slow movement of water over the places where land used to rise, in the minerals dissolved into its vastness, minerals that once formed mountains, coastlines, the foundation of something that held shape. The ocean remembers, and we drift on that memory. Not seeking proof, we learned from Atlantis that proof is not the point, not building theories. We learn that theories only create distance from the feeling we are actually approaching. We drift simply to be in the presence of what was, or what might have been, or what exists now only as the empty space where something is missing, a gap in the pattern that makes the pattern itself visible. The water tonight is calm. So calm it feels less like a surface and more like a threshold, the boundary between one state and another, between waking and sleeping, between remembering and forgetting, between the world we can touch and the world we can only feel in the moments before consciousness releases its hold. This is where Lemuria waits, not actively, not with intention, but the way all dissolved things wait, dispersed into the medium that absorbed them, present everywhere and nowhere, lost and found simultaneously. We have returned to the voyage, not to solve anything, not to discover or prove or claim, but to drift again, to let the rhythm of water become the rhythm of breath, to allow the darkness to soften the edges of thought until thought becomes something closer to dream. And in that drift, in that softening, perhaps we will sense what the ocean has always known. That beneath us, in the deep places where light does not penetrate and time moves in geological patience, something rests, something older than Atlantis, older than cities, older than the division of the world into the shapes we recognize, something that was whole before it fractured, something that was connected before it separated, something that was land before it became ocean. Lemuria, not a place we can return to, but a memory the ocean carries. And tonight, we carry it with the ocean, slowly, gently, without urgency or destination, simply moving through the dark water towards something that exists only in the moving. The ocean breathes, we breathe with it, and the voyage continues. Names are strange things. They survive long after the things they named have disappeared. They drift through time like seeds on wind, landing in unexpected places, taking root in languages and cultures that have no connection to the original speakers. Some names die with the civilizations that spoke them, lost completely when the last person who knew their meaning stopped breathing. But other names persist. They cross oceans. They appear in stories told by people who should never have heard them. They survive translation and mistranslation and the slow erosion of meaning, until what remains is not the original word, but its echo. Lemuria is one of these names. It should not have survived. It should not appear in text from India and oral traditions from Pacific Islands and theories proposed by scientists in Europe who had never set foot in those places. It should not surface again and again across such vast distances and cultural differences, unless something, some memory, some pattern, some truth too persistent to erase, was holding it in circulation. But it does survive, and in surviving, It asks a question without words. Why? The name itself is strange, not ancient, actually. Not in the way Atlantis is ancient, appearing first in Plato's dialogues 24 centuries ago. Lemuria as a word is newer than that. It appeared in the 19th century, coined by a zoologist, trying to solve a puzzle about lemurs, those wide-eyed primates found in Madagascar and India, but nowhere in between. How did the same animals appear on landmasses so far apart? The zoologist proposed an answer. There must have been a land bridge, a continent, or something like a continent, that once connected what is now separated, a place where lemurs could have walked from one shore to another without ever crossing open ocean. He called this theoretical land Lemuria, after the creatures whose distribution seemed impossible without it, a scientific theory, nothing more. But the name did something the theory could not. It resonated. It touched something in the human imagination that had been waiting for a word to attach to. It gave form to a feeling that had existed long before the zoologist wrote his paper. The feeling that the world was once more connected, that what is now broken was once whole, that beneath the ocean lie the remains of lands that bridged the gaps we see now. And once the name existed, stories came forward to claim it. Stories from Tamil culture in southern India spoke of Kumari Kandam, a vast land that stretched south from the subcontinent into the Indian Ocean, a land that had been swallowed by rising seas over many generations, a motherland, a place of origin, now lost beneath waves. The stories had existed for centuries before anyone called the lost land Lemuria. But when the name appeared, it fit. It gave the stories a word that could travel beyond their original language, a word that made the memory portable. Stories from Pacific Island cultures spoke of vast lands that once connected the scattered islands, lands where ancestors had walked freely across distances that now required days of sailing, lands that sank gradually, forcing people to become navigators, to develop the skills of reading stars and currents because the solid paths had disappeared. These stories, too, had existed long before the word Lemuria, but the word gathered them, gave them a common reference point, allowed people separated by thousands of miles of ocean to recognize that they were remembering something similar, and in the gathering the name became more than a scientific hypothesis. It became a symbol, a placeholder for the human sense that something was lost, that the world we live in now is fragmented, that there was a time, so long ago it exists only in the deepest layers of cultural memory, when the earth was arranged differently, and that arrangement allowed for a kind of wholeness we no longer experience. This is why the name survived, not because evidence supports it, not because geology confirms a continent called Lemuria once existed in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. The evidence, facts, suggests otherwise. The theory of plate tectonics explains continental drift and the distribution of species without requiring lost lands. The ocean floor shows no signs of recently sunken continents, but the name persists anyway, because some names survive not because they are accurate, but because they are necessary. They provide a shape for something shapeless, a word for something that exists as feeling before it exists as thought. A way to talk about loss so vast and ancient that it cannot be remembered directly, only sensed as absence. Lemuria holds this absence. It names the space where connection used to be, where the world was less divided, where land formed bridges instead of barriers, where the ocean had not yet claimed as much territory. Different cultures remember this absence differently. In India, Lemuria is often described as a place of high culture, a civilization that predated all known civilizations, a source from which wisdom flowed outward into the younger cultures that came after. The stories speak of libraries and sages and knowledge that was lost when the land sank. In Pacific traditions, the lost lands are remembered more as geography than culture, less about what was built there, and more about the simple fact of connection. The stories speak of ancestors who walked where now we sail, of lands that made the ocean smaller, of a time when the scattered islands were not scattered, but parts of a continuous whole. In theosophical and mystical traditions that emerged in the 19th and 20th centuries, Lemuria became something else entirely, spiritual homeland, a place where humanity existed in a different form, a different state of consciousness, where the boundaries between physical and spiritual were softer, where evolution was not just biological but metaphysical. These interpretations differ wildly. Some speak of stone cities, others speak of no cities at all. Some place Lemuria in the Indian Ocean, others in the Pacific. Some describe it as a single landmass, others as a series of connected islands. Some say it sank catastrophically, others say it eroded gradually over millennia. But beneath the differences, something remains constant: the sense of loss, the feeling that what we have now is less than what once was, that the divisions we experience between continents, between peoples, between land and water were relatively recent, that there was a time before the breaking, and the memory of that time persists even though the time itself is unreachable. This is what the name carries: not facts, not locations, not provable claims about what existed where and when, but the weight of absence. The space in human memory where something vast used to be and is no longer. The scar tissue of separation, the phantom limb of land, and once connected us, and now does not. And perhaps this is enough. Perhaps the persistence of the name Lemuria across cultures and centuries is itself the evidence, not evidence of a specific place, but evidence of a shared human experience, the experience of living in a world that feels fragmented, that feels like it should be more whole than it is, that feels like something essential was lost long ago, before anyone alive can remember, but the loss still shapes how we see the world. The ocean holds this loss. It covers the places where land bridges might have been, where coastlines might have extended, where shallow seas might have allowed crossing on foot. It holds these possibilities without confirming them, without denying them. It simply moves over the space where the questions exist, indifferent to whether the questions ever find answers. And we drift on that indifference, carried by water that does not care whether Lemuria was real, that does not need the name to be accurate, that will continue moving in its ancient rhythms long after the last person who speaks the word Lemuria has stopped speaking. The name will fade eventually. All names do. But for now, it persists. It surfaces in conversations and stories, and moments when someone tries to articulate the feeling that the world was once different, once more connected, once whole, in a way it is not whole now. And in persisting, the name does its work. It keeps the question alive, not the question of where Lemuria was, or whether it was, but the deeper question beneath. What does it mean to live in a world that feels broken? What does it mean to carry memory of wholeness we cannot verify? What does it mean to name something that might never have existed, except as the shape of what we long for? The ocean offers no answers. It simply continues, moving over the places where the name points, covering what might have been, holding the possibility without resolving it. And we, drifting here in the dark water, understand that this is enough. The name has survived, and in surviving it has given us something to follow, not toward discovery, but toward the feeling itself. The ancient persistent feeling that beneath the ocean, beneath the divisions, beneath the fragmented world we know, something older rests, something that was whole, something that remembers being whole, even if we cannot. Imagine a world without borders, not the political kind, those come much later, but the fundamental divisions, the separations between land masses that make the map look like broken pieces of something that was once continuous, the gaps filled with ocean, the distances that require sailing. Imagine all of that connected, not as a single supercontinent that existed even earlier, and geologists have named it and mapped its slow fracturing over hundreds of millions of years, but something more recent, something closer to human time, close enough if humans existed then. They might have walked across lands that are now separated by thousands of miles of open water. This is the world Lemuria inhabits in memory, not a world of cities and monuments, but a world of connection, of slow coastlines that curved gently from what is now India toward what is now Madagascar, of land bridges that stretched across the spaces where the Indian Ocean now flows, of shallow seas warm enough to wade through, of islands so numerous and close together that traveling between them required no great skill in navigation, because the next shore was always visible. A world before division, before the earth settled into its current arrangement, before the ocean claimed the territory it holds now, before the continents drifted into the isolation that makes them continents. The air would have been different then, warmer, perhaps, more humid. The kind of warmth that comes from vast shallow waters heated by sun, releasing moisture that softens everything. Coastlines would have been indefinite, places where land gradually gave way to marsh, and marsh gave way to lagoon, and lagoon gave way to open water. So slowly you could walk for days and never be certain when you stopped being on land and started being in ocean. No sharp boundaries, no clear edges, just gradual transitions from one state to another. The land itself would have been low, not mountainous, not dramatic, just gentle rises that emerged from the water like the backs of sleeping creatures, covered in vegetation that thrived in the constant moisture, mangroves at the edges, dense forest inland, plants that existed before humans gave them names or purposes, plants that simply grew because the conditions allowed growth, and life moved through this world slowly. Not because it lacked energy, but because there was no reason to hurry. The climate was stable, food was abundant, the warm, shallow seas teemed with fish, the forests provided fruit and shelter. There was no scarcity to drive innovation, no hardship to force adaptation, just abundance, quiet, unremarkable abundance. The kind that does not create stories, because stories require conflict, and here there was none. Animals moved along the land bridges without knowing they were bridges, without knowing that millions of years later, their fossil remains would puzzle scientists who could not understand how the same species appeared on land masses now separated by ocean. They simply followed food and warmth and the gentle paths that led from one feeding ground to another. And if humans existed in this world, and perhaps they did, in small numbers, in forms we would barely recognize as human, they moved the same way, following coastlines, following rivers, following the gradual transitions from land to water and back to land, not building anything permanent, because permanence was not necessary, not creating monuments because there was nothing that needed commemorating, just living, moving with the seasons, with the tides, with the slow rhythms that governed everything, before humans learned to measure time in units smaller than generations. This world had no nations, no territories, no concept of ownership, because the land was too vast, and a people too few, and the abundance too reliable to require defending resources. If you walked far enough, you found more of everything: more coastline, more forest, more warm water, more fish, more fruit. There was no reason to stay in one place and claim it, no reason to build walls or draw lines, or establish the kinds of boundaries that would later define civilization. The world was open, connected not just geographically, but in the way life moved through it. Seeds carried by birds across the land bridges, animals following the same migration routes, generation after generation. Humans, if they were there, sharing genes across distances, because the distances were walkable. No isolation, no evolution of distinct cultures or languages or physical characteristics, because there were no barriers to gene flow. Everyone was connected to everyone else through the slow interchange of movement and mixing. This is the world before division, before separation became necessary. Before the ocean rose or the land sank, geology does not care which description we use, and the connections dissolved. Before the bridges became water, before the continuous coastline fragmented into islands, before the single warm sea became the Indian Ocean, in this world there was no need for memory, because nothing had been lost yet. Nothing had ended. The world simply continued, unchanging, through spans of time so long that individual lives were meaningless. Generations passed, lineages came and went, but the shape of the world remained constant until it did not, until something shifted, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but with the slow inevitability of geological process. The kind of change that happens over so many generations that no single generation notices, that exists only when you compare the beginning to the end and see that what was connected is now separate. The land bridges began to thin, not collapse, not sink dramatically in earthquakes or floods, just thin. The water rose, or the land subsided, or both happened simultaneously. The mechanics matter less than the result. What had been solid ground became marsh. What had been marsh became shallow sea. What had been walkable became something that required swimming, then wading, then eventually boats. The connections weakened. The animals that had moved freely along the bridges found the paths growing uncertain. Some adapted by learning to swim longer distances. Some were trapped on what became islands. Some went extinct when their range shrank below the minimum needed for viable populations. And the humans, if they were there, began to separate, not by choice, not through conflict or decision, but simply because the world no longer allowed the easy interchange that had kept everyone connected. The groups on what became Madagascar lost contact with the groups on what remained of the Asian mainland. The groups on the Pacific Islands could no longer walk to the next island when resources grew scarce. They became islanders, not by culture, but by geography. The world had divided them. And in that division, something changed. Isolation bred difference. Languages diverged. Appearances shifted. Cultures developed distinct characteristics because there was no longer constant mixing to smooth the variations into uniformity. The world of connection became the world of fragments. And slowly, over more generations than anyone could count, the memory of connection faded, became myth, became story, became the sense that the world should be more whole than it is, that the divisions are relatively recent, that there was a time, no one can say when you could walk from India to Africa, when the Pacific Islands were not islands, but peaks in a continuous landscape, when the ocean did not separate, but surrounded a world that was itself whole. This is what Lemuria represents. Not a civilization, not an empire, not a culture with achievements we can measure, but the memory of that world before division, the world where connection was the default state, where the ocean had not yet claimed its full territory, where the earth was still deciding its final form, a world that existed without leaving monuments because monuments were not necessary. A world that was simply present, abundant, connected, until it gradually ceased to be. And when it ceased, when the waters rose and the bridges thinned and the connections dissolved, all that remained was the feeling that something vast had been lost, something essential, something that made the world make sense in a way it no longer does. And we, drifting here in the dark water above where those land bridges might have been, feel that loss without understanding it. Feel the absence of connection. Feel the weight of living in a fragmented world, and wonder, in the quiet spaces before sleep, what it would have been like to walk where now we can only float, to cross on foot what now requires ships, to live in a world before division taught us what it means to be separate. The ocean holds that memory, not in words, not in artifacts, but in the space itself, the vast space between shores that once were closer, the water covering what once was land, the slow rhythm that continues, indifferent to whether anyone remembers what came before, and we drift on that indifference, carried by water that once was somewhere else, floating above land that once was higher, moving through a world that has already forgotten what it used to be, but cannot quite forget that it used to be different. There is a kind of civilization that leaves no trace, not because it was primitive or small or insignificant, but because it was designed differently, built on principles that did not require permanence, that did not see the need to carve stone or raise towers or create structures meant to outlast the people who built them. This is the civilization that might have existed in Lemuria, if it existed at all, not like Atlantis with its careful rings and golden temples and laws inscribed on pillars, not like the civilizations we recognize from history, the ones defined by what they left behind, pyramids, aqueducts, walls, the archaeological evidence that proves people were here and built things and wanted those things to announce their presence across time. Lemuria, if it held people, held a different kind of people. People who lived lightly on the land, who moved with the seasons rather than controlling them, who built with materials that returned to the earth within a generation, bamboo and palm leaves, woven grasses, structures that served their purpose and then dissolved back into the forest when their purpose was complete. No stone to excavate, no metal to corrode, no pottery shards to catalog. Just the soft materials of a world where abundance meant you did not need to hoard, preserve, or build for future scarcity, because scarcity was not part of the pattern. The knowledge they carried was not written. It could not be written because writing requires a reason to fix knowledge in place, to make it transportable across distance and time, to separate the knowing from the knower. But in a world where communities remained stable for generations, where elders lived long enough to pass their understanding directly to the young, where the same patterns repeated year after year without disruption, there was no need for writing. Knowledge lived in bodies, in the movements of ritual, in the rhythms of song, in the patterns of dance that encoded information about seasons and tides, and the behavior of animals and the locations of fresh water, knowledge that was practiced rather than recorded, that existed in the doing of it, rather than in symbols that represented the doing. This kind of knowledge leaves nothing behind. When the people who carry it disappear, the knowledge disappears with them. When the communities dissolve, when the coastlines sink, when the connections break, and the survivors scatter to distant shores, they carry fragments, pieces of the pattern, echoes of the songs, movements whose original meaning has been forgotten, but whose form still feels important enough to preserve. And these fragments surface in unexpected places, in the rituals of Pacific Island cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean, but performing gestures so similar they must share a common origin. In the navigation techniques that allow people to cross vast distances using only the stars and waves and the flight patterns of birds, knowledge so sophisticated it rivals modern technology, passed down through generations without ever being written. In the myths that speak of primordial lands of ancestors who walked where now the ocean flows, of knowledge given by the land itself before the land disappeared, these fragments might be all that remains of Lemuria. Not the place itself, but what the place taught. Not the civilization, but its memory dispersed into the cultures that came after, diluted, transformed, but still carrying something of the original pattern. The people of Lemuria, if they were people as we understand the term, did not seek to dominate their environment. They did not see nature as something to be conquered or controlled or improved upon. They saw themselves as part of the pattern, not separate from it, not above it. They moved with the tides, because the tides were not obstacles, but rhythms to align with. They fished when the fish came. They gathered fruit when it ripened. They moved to higher ground when the waters rose, and returned to the shore when the waters receded. Not in response to crisis, but in participation with the slow oscillations of a world that provided everything if we paid attention to its rhythms. This is a hard thing for us to imagine now. We live in a world defined by resistance, by the triumph of human will over natural limitation, by the ability to live in climates that would kill us without technology, to eat foods grown on the other side of the planet, to stay awake after dark, to be warm in winter and cool in summer, and comfortable in conditions that would be impossible without constant intervention. We have built a civilization that proves we are stronger than nature. But Lemuria was not about strength. It was about harmony, about finding the place in the pattern where human life fit without forcing, about discovering that abundance already existed if you arranged yourself correctly in relation to it, about understanding that the world provided without needing to be conquered. This does not mean they were simple. Simplicity is not the same as lack of sophistication. The knowledge required to live in harmony with complex natural systems is immense. To know which plants are edible and which are poison, to read weather in the behavior of insects, to navigate by stars, to maintain oral histories across generations without losing essential information, to organize communities without written law. This requires intelligence of a different kind than ours. Not the intelligence of accumulation and analysis and abstract thought, but the intelligence of attention, of noticing, of remembering relationships between things, of holding vast amounts of interconnected information in living memory rather than external storage. The people of Lemuria would have been masters of this intelligence. They would have known their world with an intimacy we cannot match, known it not as data, but as relationship, known every plant and animal and current and wind pattern, not because they studied it, but because they lived inside it, because their survival depended not on controlling it, but on reading it correctly, and they would have passed this knowledge forward through ceremony, through the repetition of patterns that contained information, through songs that encoded the locations of resources, through dances that taught the proper timing of planting and harvesting, through stories that preserved the memory of what worked and what did not across generations, too numerous to count. This is civilization without monuments. Civilization that exists in the living rather than in what the living leave behind. It is invisible to archaeology. It cannot be carbon dated or excavated or reconstructed from remains, because it left no remains. When it ended, when the land sank and the people scattered, it simply dissolved. The knowledge dispersed into fragments. The songs were sung in new contexts until their original meanings were forgotten. The ceremonies were adapted to new environments until they no longer resembled what they had been, and what remains is only the sense that something was there, something sophisticated, something whole, something that understood the world in ways we have forgotten because we chose a different path, a path of permanence and control, and monuments that announce our presence. We chose to leave traces. Lemuria, perhaps, chose not to. Chose to live in a way that did not scar the land, that did not require stone or metal or structures that would persist after the people were gone, that existed as pure presence, fully alive in its moment, fully integrated with its environment, and then, when the moment passed, fully dissolved. There is a beauty in this. The beauty of impermanence embraced rather than resisted. The beauty of a civilization that measured success, not by what it built, but by how well it fit, by how little it disrupted, by how completely it participated in the rhythms that were already there. But there is also loss, because when a civilization leaves no monuments, we cannot prove it existed. We cannot point to stones and say, they were here. We cannot reconstruct their lives from artifacts. We cannot know for certain that anything we sense about them is real rather than projected. All we have are the fragments, the scattered pieces of knowledge, the similar myths told on distant shores. The sense that the people who live on islands in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific share something deeper than coincidence, that they remember something even though they cannot say what they remember. That somewhere in the deep past, before writing, before nations, before the world divided into the shapes we recognize, there was a way of living that required no monuments, because the people were themselves some monuments. Living expressions of knowledge, walking libraries, breathing archives of everything their ancestors had learned about how to exist in harmony with a world that was generous if you knew how to receive its generosity. And when the world changed, when the waters rose and the land bridges thinned and the connections broke, that way of living could not survive because it depended on stability, on the assumption that the pattern would continue, that the coastlines would remain where they had always been, that the knowledge passed from one generation to the next would remain relevant. But the waters did not care about relevance. They rose anyway, and the civilization without monuments, the culture carried in bodies and songs and ceremonies, had nothing solid to hold on to. Nothing that could survive submersion, nothing that would wash up on distant shores to prove it had existed, only the people themselves and the fragments they carried, and the sense passed down through their descendants that the world was once different, once whole, once connected in ways that made this kind of civilization possible. We cannot excavate Lemuria, cannot date its artifacts or reconstruct its cities, or prove it existed in any way that would satisfy science. But we can feel its absence, the space where that kind of civilization might have been, the possibility that humans once lived differently, not better or worse, but differently, in harmony rather than dominance, in impermanence rather than permanence, in participation rather than control. And perhaps that absence, that possibility, is itself a kind of monument, not stone, but the lack of stone, not evidence, but the presence of something that leaves no evidence, a civilization designed to leave no scars, that succeeded so completely in leaving no scars that we cannot prove it ever existed, but cannot quite convince ourselves it did not. Some places do not fall, they thin. They do not collapse in a single catastrophic moment, but dissolve gradually over time, so long that the people living through it do not recognize they are living through an ending. Each generation experiences only the world as it is during their lifetime. Each assumes the changes they notice are temporary, local, reversible. They do not see the pattern because the pattern takes longer to complete than a human life. This is how Lemuria disappeared, not in fire or flood, not in a day and a night like Atlantis, but across centuries, millennia perhaps, so slowly that the sinking was invisible to those it was happening to, so gradually that adaptation seemed possible until, suddenly, it was not. The first changes would have been subtle. A spring that had always provided fresh water begins to taste of salt, not every day, just occasionally, on the highest tides. When the moon is full and the ocean swells higher than usual, the salt intrudes into the aquifer, and for a few days the water is undrinkable. But then the tide recedes, the salt fades, the water returns to normal, and people think it was just that one time, an anomaly, nothing to worry about, except it happens again the next full moon, and the one after that. And slowly, over years, the periods of salt water grow longer, the periods of fresh water grow shorter, until the spring that sustained a community for generations can no longer sustain it. They move inland, not far, just far enough to find another spring, another source of fresh water uncontaminated by the advancing ocean. They rebuild their homes, they establish new gathering places, they adapt, because humans are good at adapting, especially when the changes come slowly enough that adaptation feels like choice rather than necessity. But the ocean does not stop. The coastlines begin to change shape. The beach where fishing nets were always dried grows narrower. The point where the land met the sea, once a clear boundary, becomes uncertain. High tides reach farther inland. Storm surges that once came every few years begin to come every season. The low-lying areas, the marshes, the tidal flats, the places where land and water mixed, begin to tip toward water. What had been solid ground that flooded occasionally becomes pools that drain occasionally. What had been walkable becomes wading. What had been wading becomes swimming. And the land bridges that had connected the islands, the paths that animals and people had used for so long, they were worn smooth, begin to disappear, not all at once. First, they become impassable at high tide. You can still cross them, but you have to time it, wait for low tide, move quickly. Carry your belongings above your head if the water is deeper than expected. Then they become impassable, except at the lowest tides, once a month, twice a month. On the days when the moon and sun align to pull the water away from shore as far as it will go, and even then the crossing is uncertain, dangerous. And then one generation notices that the paths their grandparents used are no longer visible at any tide. The water covers them always. What had been a bridge is now simply ocean. What had been a short walk is now a journey requiring boats. The world is coming apart, not dramatically, not in a way that inspires stories of divine punishment, or cosmic catastrophe, just slowly, reliably, inch by inch, year by year, the water claiming what had been land. Communities that had been connected become isolated. The people on what is becoming Madagascar lose contact with the people on the mainland, not suddenly, not because of war or decision, but because the distance grows too great to cross casually, because the journey that used to take a few days now takes weeks, because the risks increase as the open water between shores expands. Families separate. Children who move to higher ground lose touch with parents who stayed near the shore, not because they stop caring, but because returning becomes harder each year, because the landmarks change, because the paths disappear, because the world they knew is being reorganized by water, and navigation becomes guesswork. Languages begin to diverge. When communities are connected, language stays relatively uniform. Variations are smoothed out by constant interchange. But when isolation sets in, when groups stop talking to each other regularly, the differences accumulate. Words shift. Pronunciations change. New terms develop for local conditions. Meanings drift. And after enough time, people who were once part of the same culture can no longer understand each other's speech. The animals respond to the changes before the humans do. Species that depended on the land bridges, that had ranged freely across what is now divided, find their populations splitting. The groups on different islands stop interbreeding, begin to adapt to local conditions, begin to diverge genetically. Some species go extinct when their range shrinks below viability, when the population becomes too small to sustain genetic diversity, when inbreeding reduces fitness until the last individual dies without offspring. Others adapt, become smaller, develop new strategies for crossing water, learn to survive on less space, fewer resources, more competition, but the overall pattern is loss, not sudden extinction, gradual thinning, populations that were once robust becoming fragile, ecosystems that were once interconnected becoming isolated and simplified. The people watch this happen without understanding it. They notice that certain animals are no longer seen, that certain plants no longer grow. They tell stories about how things used to be when the land provided more abundantly, but they do not connect the changes to the rising water, to the fragmenting of their world. They think they are experiencing local variations, bad years, temporary setbacks. They do not see that they are living through a planetary reorganization, that the Earth is settling into a new configuration, that the ocean is expanding its territory, that what they experience as loss is, from the ocean's perspective, simply reclamation. The water is taking back what it had temporarily yielded, and there is nothing to be done about it. No technology to build, no prayers to offer, no rituals to perform that will stop the slow advance of the sea. The process is geological, operating on timescales that make human intervention meaningless. All they can do is move, and they do move, again and again, generation after generation, retreating from coastlines that creep inland, abandoning settlements that become uninhabitable, condensing into smaller areas as the total land available shrinks, and in the moving, condensing, in the slow loss of territory, something else is lost. Love that had been possible in the world before division, the abundance that came from vast territories, the ease that came from low population density, the harmony that came from having more than enough space for everyone. As the land shrinks, competition increases. Resources that were once plentiful become contested. Communities that had coexisted peacefully because there was room for everyone begin to come into conflict over what remains. The civilization without monuments begins to fracture. Not because the people have changed, but because the world has changed. Because the conditions that allowed that kind of civilization, the stability, the abundance, the connection, no longer exist. And slowly, across more time than we can easily imagine, Lemuria ceases to be a place. The lands that were once connected are now separated. The coastlines that were once gentle and extensive are now sharp and restricted. The shallow seas are now deep ocean. The bridges are now abysses. What remains are islands, scattered, isolated, each holding remnants of what had been a continuous culture, each developing its own variations, each remembering, in fragments, that they were once part of something larger, but the whole is gone, dissolved into water, not destroyed, not punished, not erased by divine judgment or human folly, simply reclaimed by processes older than civilization, older than humanity, older than any species currently alive. The earth settling, the ocean rising, the slow, patient redistribution of land and water. It has happened countless times before and will happen countless times again. Lemuria did not fall. It thinned, slowly enough that no one noticed they were living through its disappearance, gradually enough that each generation adapted to the new conditions without recognizing they were adaptations, completely enough that what remains is not the place itself, but only the memory that the place was once different, once whole, once connected, once generous in ways it is no longer generous. And we, drifting here above where those lands might have been, feel the thinning without seeing it, feel the loss without witnessing it, feel the slow unraveling that happened so gradually it left no dramatic story, just the quiet truth that the world changes, and sometimes the change is so slow we do not notice until it is complete, until what was solid is liquid, until what was connected is separate, until what was Lemuria is ocean. There comes a moment in every gradual process when the gradual becomes complete. When what has been changing finishes changing, when the transformation that seemed endless reaches its endpoint, when the slow erosion of one state into another finally resolves into the new state being all that remains. For Lemuria, this moment was quiet. No earthquakes marked it. No tsunamis announced it. No witnesses stood on distant shores watching the final submersion, because the final submersion was not an event, but a realization. The understanding which came to different people at different times, that the land was no longer land in any meaningful sense, that what had been solid was now liquid, that what had been home was now ocean. The last mountains became islands. The peaks that had been highlands, the places where people retreated as the waters rose, became isolated points rising from the sea, still visible, still habitable, but no longer connected to anything. The people who lived on these shrinking islands watched their world contract, watched the forests thin as salt water infiltrated the soil, watched the springs go brackish, watched the animals disappear, not all at once, but slowly, as populations became too small to sustain themselves, and they understood, finally, that they could not stay, that adaptation had limits. That retreat had an ending, that the water would not stop rising until it had covered everything that could be covered. Some left by choice, building boats, learning to navigate, carrying what they could, seeds, tools, stories, to distant shores where land still stood high enough to promise a future. They became the ancestors of island peoples, of cultures defined by the ocean rather than land, of navigators who could cross vast distances, because crossing vast distances was the only way to survive. Others stayed until staying was no longer possible, until the island they lived on was too small to support even a handful of people, until the storms grew too fierce for the remaining vegetation to withstand, until the last fresh water disappeared, and there was nothing to drink but salt, and then they too left, or they perished. The ocean does not record which, and the islands themselves continue to shrink. What had been mountains became hills. What had been hills became rocky outcrops. What had been outcrops became shoals, places where the water was shallow enough that you could feel bottom, but not shallow enough to stand. And then the shoals disappeared too, covered by the slow, patient rise of water that had been rising all along, but now had no more obstacles, no more land to contest, no more high ground to retreat to. The ocean closed over the last visible traces of Lemuria, not violently, not dramatically, but completely. The surface became uniform, no islands breaking the pattern, no mountains visible on the horizon, just water extending in all directions, deep where it had been shallow, unbroken where it had been divided by land, and beneath that surface, Lemuria rested. The mountains were still there, but now they were seamounts. The hills were still there, but now they were ridges on the ocean floor. The coastlines were still there, but now they marked the edges of underwater plateaus. The land had not disappeared, it had simply changed state, from air to water, from visible to submerged, from habitable to uninhabitable, from present to absent in every way that mattered to the beings who had lived there. The ocean which had surrounded Lemuria now permeated it. Water filled the valleys, flowed through the forests, stripping leaves from trees that could not survive submersion, entered the caves and hollows, saturated the soil until soil became sediment, covered the paths people had walked, the places where they had gathered, the springs they had drunk from, the clearings where they had danced. Everything the water touched, it transformed. Wood became waterlogged and began to decay. Stone remained but took on different textures as minerals dissolved and new ones precipitated. Metal corroded. Anything organic, the bamboo structures, the woven shelters, the tools made from plant fibers, dissolved within years. The civilization without monuments left no monuments beneath the waves either. What had been invisible to archaeology on land became invisible to archaeology underwater. The materials that had composed the Lemurian life, if it existed as we imagine it, were not materials that could survive submersion. They returned to the elements that had formed them. And after enough time, decades, centuries, even the shapes were gone. The clearings filled with sediment. The paths were covered by sand. The places where humans had been became indistinguishable from the places where humans had never been. The ocean smoothed everything, not cruelly, not with intention, but with the same patient erosion it applies to all things, slowly wearing away the evidence of difference, slowly reducing variation to uniformity, slowly making the ocean floor a place where nothing stands out because everything has been standing for so long in the same conditions, and the life of the ocean moved in. Fish that had never known dry land swam through spaces where people had once walked. Coral began to grow on the submerged mountains, turning them into reefs. Seaweed anchored itself in soil that had once grown terrestrial plants. Crustaceans scuttled across surfaces that had once been gathering places for communities that no longer existed. The ocean did not remember Lemuria. It simply occupied the space where Lemuria had been, simply filled the vacuum left by the land's retreat. simply continued its own processes, currents and temperatures and the slow circulation of nutrients, without any acknowledgement that this space had once been different. Because to the ocean, it was not different. Land and water are temporary states. The earth shifts between them continuously. What is coast today was seabed yesterday. What is seabed today will be coast tomorrow, not our tomorrow, but the earth's tomorrow, measured in millions of years. The ocean does not mourn transitions. It participates in them. It is the mechanism by which they happen. It is both the cause of the change and the result of it. The water that covered Lemuria had always been there, held in different configurations, frozen in glaciers, locked in polar ice, stored in the atmosphere as vapor. And when the ice melted or the land sank, geology offers multiple explanations for sea level changes. The water simply moved from where it had been to where it could be, from locked to liquid, from vapor to ocean. It covered Lemuria, the way it had covered countless other lands before, the way it would cover countless more in the ages to come, without preference, without judgment, without any sense that what it covered mattered more or less than anything else it covered. This is the final stage of the long unraveling, when the finning becomes absence, when the gradual becomes complete, when what had been slowly disappearing finishes disappearing, when the land becomes water, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but actually. The molecules that had been organized as land, bound into stone and soil and living matter, disperse into the ocean, become part of its chemical composition, contribute to its salinity, its mineral content, its ability to support life. Lemuria dissolves, not into nothing, but into everything, into the medium that covers it, into the water that holds it, into the ocean that will carry traces of it, calcium from limestone, iron from basalt, organic compounds from the forests, for as long as the ocean exists. And on the surface where we drift, there is no indication. The water looks the same as water everywhere, moves the same, reflects the same sky, responds to the same moon pulling the same tides. You could sail over Lemuria every day and never know it was there. The ocean keeps what it covers not by hiding it, but by transforming it so completely that the original form becomes irrelevant, becomes unrecognizable, becomes part of the ocean itself, rather than something separate that the ocean contains. This is how land becomes water, slowly, completely, irreversibly, until the distinction between them dissolves, until what was Lemuria is simply ocean, and what was ocean has always been ocean, and the memory of land becomes something carried not by the place, but by those who left it, by the descendants scattered across distant islands, by the fragments of stories passed down through generations, by the sense, persistent and unverifiable, that beneath the water something rests that was once more than water. But the water does not confirm this. It simply continues, moving in its rhythms, holding what it holds, offering nothing but its own presence, deep, calm, complete. When a continent disappears, it does not vanish completely. It scatters. The land dissolves into ocean, but the people who lived there carry pieces of it forward. Not the soil or stone, those stay behind, submerged, but something else, something less tangible, but more persistent. Memory, not the clear memory of facts and dates and specific events. Those fade within a few generations, but deeper memory, the kind that lives in gesture and ritual, and the stories people tell to explain why they do things the way they do them. This memory surfaces in unexpected places. In southern India, in the Tamil-speaking regions, there are stories of Kumari, Kandam, of a vast land that stretched south from the subcontinent into what is now the Indian Ocean, a place of great learning, of ancient cities, of a culture so old it predated everything that came after. The stories say the land was swallowed by the sea in the three great floods, spread across thousands of years, that the survivors moved north, carrying their knowledge, their language, their traditions, that what is now Tamil culture is actually a fragment of something older, something that existed when the world was shaped fortify. These are not modern stories. They appear in texts written over 1,000 years ago, references to lost lands, to ancestors who came from the south, from places that no longer exist, to a time when the coastline extended far beyond where it is now. The stories cannot be verified. There is no archaeological evidence of cities beneath the Indian Ocean where the Tamil texts place them. No ruins that match the descriptions, but the persistence of the stories suggests something. Some memory of coastal lands that did exist once and were lost to rising seas. Some truth buried beneath layers of myth and time, and the human tendency to elaborate. Across the ocean in the Pacific, there are similar stories, not identical, not using the same names or describing the same places, but sharing a pattern. Island cultures separated by thousands of miles of water tell stories of ancestral lands, of places where their people originated, of great islands or continents that sank, forcing the survivors to become navigators. The Maori speak of Hawaii, a homeland somewhere to the west, a place of origin that their ancestors left generations ago, sailing east across the Pacific until they found the islands they now inhabit. The Polynesians speak of lost lands in various forms, of islands that once were larger, of archipelagos that once were connected, of a time when voyaging was unnecessary because you could walk between the places that now require sailing. The details differ, but the feeling is constant, the feeling that they came from somewhere else, somewhere that no longer exists in the form it once did, somewhere that was lost to water. And the remarkable thing is this: these cultures are too far apart to have influenced each other directly. The Tamil speakers of India and the Polynesian navigators of the Pacific should have no cultural connection. The distance is too great, the ocean between them too vast. And yet both carry stories of lost lands. Both remember ancestors who came from places now submerged. Both speak of motherlands swallowed by the sea. This is what remains after a continent vanishes. Not the continent itself, but the pattern it leaves in human memory, the impression it makes on the cultures that survive its sinking, the stories that travel with the people who escaped and become part of the foundational myths of new societies in new lands. These stories are not accurate records. They have been transformed by time and retelling, and the needs of the communities that preserve them. They have accumulated embellishments, been merged with other stories, been shaped to serve cultural purposes that have nothing to do with historical accuracy. But beneath the elaboration, something persists, the memory of loss, of lands that were and are no more, of ancestors who lived in places we cannot visit because those places are now ocean. And in the details, the similarities between stories told by cultures that should have no contact, there are hints of shared origin, symbols that appear across vast distances: the spiral, the wave, the serpent, the tree, geometric patterns that show up in art from India to the Pacific Islands to Madagascar. Patterns so similar, they suggest either common origin or universal human psychology, And perhaps those are the same thing. Perhaps universal patterns arise because humanity had a shared experience, a shared trauma, a shared memory of living somewhere that no longer exists. The navigational knowledge itself might be a remnant. The Pacific Islanders developed navigation techniques of extraordinary sophistication. They could cross thousands of miles of open ocean without instruments, using only the stars and waves and birds and subtle signs invisible to those not trained to see them. Why would they develop such knowledge unless they needed to, unless the world they lived in had changed in a way that made navigation essential? Unless the lands that had once been connected became separated, forcing people to develop skills to cross the distances? Unless the easy walking of the past became the difficult sailing of the present? The knowledge is too sophisticated to have developed casually. It represents generations of observation and teaching and refinement. It suggests a necessity born of geography, of a world where getting from one place to another required crossing water because land was no longer an option. This might be Lemuria's legacy, not monuments or texts or physical evidence, but the navigation skills of Pacific cultures, the linguistic connections between India and Madagascar that should not exist given the distance, the shared myths of lost motherlands, the patterns in art and ritual that suggest common origin despite geographic separation. These fragments do not prove Lemuria existed, but they suggest something existed, some shared experience, some common past, some reality that gave rise to these similar stories told by separated peoples. Maybe continents do not disappear completely. Maybe they scatter, break apart into islands, into cultures, into fragments of memory carried by survivors who dispersed in all directions when the center could no longer hold. Maybe the Tamil speakers and the Polynesian navigators and the Malagasy people of Madagascar are all pieces of something larger that broke apart when the land that held it together sank beneath the waves. And maybe the stories they tell, the myths of Kumari Kandam and Hawaii and lost homelands, are not fabrications but fragmentary memories of an actual place. A place that existed before the ocean claimed it, a place that connected what is now separate, a place that scattered into the peoples who now remember it differently, because they drifted to different shores and adapted to different conditions and lost direct contact with each other. This is how memory works after catastrophic loss. It does not preserve details accurately. It preserves feeling, pattern, the sense that something important was lost, even if the specifics of what was lost have become unclear. And across generations, the feeling transforms into story. The pattern becomes myth. The sense of loss becomes the narrative of a golden age, of ancestors who knew more, of lands that provided abundantly, of a time before the world broke into the difficult fragments we inhabit now. The stories serve the people who tell them. They explain origins. They provide identity. They give meaning to the difficulties of the present by suggesting they are remnants of something that was once whole, but they also preserve something real, not in their details, which shift with each telling, but in their existence, in the fact that separated cultures tell variations of the same story, in the persistence of the idea that the world was once different, once more connected, once whole, in a way it is no longer whole. Lemuria might be the name we give to this lost wholeness, the placeholder for whatever actually existed, the symbol that gathers the scattered fragments of memory and gives them a common reference point. It might not have been called Lemuria by the people who lived there. It might not have been a single continent. It might not match any of the descriptions given in later stories. But something was there. Some configuration of land and sea that allowed for the connections we see in the fragments. some reality that gave rise to the shared symbols and similar navigation techniques and linguistic links that should not exist if these cultures had always been as separate as they are now. And when that something sank, whether continent or archipelago or extensive coastline, it broke in two pieces, geographic pieces, the islands that remain, cultural pieces, the scattered peoples who carry fragments of what was once a continuous culture, and mythic pieces, the stories that preserve the memory of wholeness, even though wholeness can no longer be experienced directly. This is what remains after a continent vanishes, not nothing, but fragments, pieces scattered across the ocean, across cultures, across time, each piece incomplete, each carrying only part of the pattern, each unable to reconstruct the whole on its own. But together, if you could gather them, if you could see them all at once, they suggest a shape, not clear, not definite, but real enough to feel, real enough to persist, real enough that we are still, centuries after the sinking, trying to understand what the fragments are fragments of. The ocean holds the rest, the parts that did not scatter, the parts that stayed behind when the people left, the physical reality of what Lemuria was before it became what Lemuria represents. And we drift here, above those unscattered parts, feeling the connection between the fragments we can see, the stories, the symbols, the shared memories, and the wholeness we cannot see, resting beneath water that will not yield it. Knowing that what remains is enough, not to prove anything, not to reconstruct completely, but to sense, to feel, to recognize that we are floating above absence. And that absence is itself a presence, the presence of something that was and is no more, the presence scattering, the presence of fragments that once were whole. There is a place where proof ends and memory begins, a threshold where the tools we use to verify reality, evidence, measurement, repeatability, can no longer reach, where the questions we ask cannot be answered with certainty, where we must choose between demanding verification and allowing uncertainty. Lemuria exists in this space, not on one side or the other, not provable or disprovable, but suspended between, existing in the territory where science says we cannot confirm, and memory says, but I remember. This makes people uncomfortable. We live in a world that privileges proof, that values what can be demonstrated over what is felt, that treats memory without evidence as unreliable, suspect, probably false. And by those standards, Lemuria fails. There is no geological evidence of a continent in the Indian Ocean that sank in human time, no core samples that show sudden submersion, no ruins on the ocean floor that match the descriptions in myths, no artifacts that prove an advanced civilization existed where the stories place it. The science is clear. The ocean floor is old, millions of years old. If a continent existed there and sank recently meaning within the last 100,000 years, we would see evidence. We do not see evidence. Therefore, the scientific conclusion is that Lemuria, as described in the myths and theories, did not exist. And perhaps that conclusion is correct. Perhaps the Tamil stories of Kumari Kandam are elaborations of smaller, localized coastal flooding. Perhaps the Pacific myths of lost lands are memories of actual islands that sank, which does happen, through volcanic activity and sea level changes, but not memories of a vast continent. Perhaps the similarities between separated cultures are coincidence, or the result of universal human psychology creating similar symbols independently, or the result of contacts we have not yet discovered, but that involve trade and migration, rather than shared origin. Perhaps, but here is what science cannot address: why the memory persists. Not the accuracy of the memory, not whether the memory corresponds to physical reality, but why humans need this memory. Why the idea of Lemuria continues to resurface generation after generation. Why people who have never heard of each other tell similar stories of lost lands. Science can tell us that the ocean floor does not support the claims, but it cannot tell us why the claims exist. And this is where proof ends, at the edge of measurable reality, at the point where the question shifts from, "Did this happen?" to "What does it mean that we believe this happened?" Memory operates differently than proof. Memory does not require verification. It does not care about core samples or tectonic plate mapping. It exists as feeling first, narrative second. It preserves not facts, but patterns, not events, but their emotional resonance. And the emotional resonance of Lemuria is powerful. The sense of loss, of fragmentation, of living in a broken world that was once whole. This resonance touches something deep in human psychology, something that might be universal. The feeling that we have been separated from something essential, that we are living in exile from a wholeness we cannot quite remember, but can sense was there. This feeling does not require Lemuria to have literally existed to be valid. The feeling is real whether or not the place was real. And perhaps this is the actual function of Lemuria. Not to be historically accurate, not to provide a factual account of ancient geography, but to give form to a feeling that would otherwise remain shapeless, to name the sense of fragmentation, to explain why the world feels broken, to offer a mythic answer to the psychological question, why do we feel like something is missing? The ocean, drifting here beneath us, does not care about this distinction. It does not care whether Lemuria existed as continent or as metaphor. It simply holds what it holds, covers what it covers, moves in its patterns regardless of what humans believe about what rests beneath its surface. And in this indifference, there is something clarifying. The ocean does not require us to prove anything, does not demand we choose between fact and feeling. It simply exists, and in existing, it creates the space where both can be present, where we can acknowledge that science finds no evidence of a sunken continent, and simultaneously acknowledge that the story of a sunken continent serves a psychological need that science cannot address, where we can accept that Lemuria might not have existed as described, and still honor the memory that it represents, where we can drift in the space between proof and memory without needing to resolve the tension between them. This is difficult for us. We want answers. We want certainty. We want to know whether Lemuria was real, so we can either believe the stories or dismiss them. But the ocean offers no such clarity. It offers only depth, only vastness, only the understanding that what it covers is inaccessible to human knowing, that we can measure in a map and sample, but we cannot see directly, cannot verify completely, cannot achieve the certainty we desire. And perhaps this is appropriate. Perhaps lost things should remain lost. Perhaps the value of Lemuria is precisely in its unverifiability, in the way it forces us to sit with uncertainty, to hold questions that have no definitive answers, to accept that some things subsist in the realm of possibility rather than proof. The stories will continue. The Tamil speakers will keep telling of Pumari Kandam. The Pacific Islanders will keep remembering lost homelands. The descendants of scattered peoples will keep sensing that they came from somewhere that no longer exists in any physical form, and the skeptics will keep pointing out that there is no evidence. And both will be right. The stories are not historically accurate in the way we understand historical accuracy. And the need for the stories is real in a way that transcends historical accuracy. We drift in the space between these truths, neither proving nor disproving, neither believing nor dismissing, simply holding the possibility, simply acknowledging that the ocean might cover more than we can measure, that memory might preserve more than we can verify, that the line between myth and reality might be softer than we assume. The water moves beneath us, patient, indifferent, holding whatever it holds without announcing what that is. And we, floating on its surface, learn to do the same, to hold Lemuria as possibility rather than certainty, as feeling rather than fact, as a question that does not require answering but only contemplating. The space between proof and memory is not empty. It is full of what cannot be measured but can be felt, full of stories that do not correspond to verifiable reality, but correspond to psychological reality, full of the human need to explain loss, fragmentation, the sense that we are living in the aftermath of something we cannot quite remember. And here, in this space, we find something unexpected, not answers, but rest. The rest that comes from releasing the need to know for certain, from accepting that some questions will remain questions, from allowing mystery to remain mysterious without experiencing that as failure. The ocean breathes, we breathe with it, and the space between proof and memory becomes the space between thoughts, the space where sleep approaches, where consciousness loosens its grip on certainty, where we can drift without destination, content to simply be present with what cannot be resolved. Lemuria waits here, not as a place to be found, but as a feeling to be felt, and perhaps that has always been enough. There is something in us that cannot let go of what is gone, even when letting go would be easier, even when holding on serves no practical purpose, even when the thing we are holding on to might never have existed in the form we imagine. We return to lost lands again and again, across cultures and centuries, and the vast distances that separate people who should have nothing in common. We tell stories of places that sank, of golden ages that ended, of homelands we can no longer return to because they no longer exist. Atlantis, Lemuria, Eden, Avalon, Shambhala, Hawaii. The names change, the details vary, but the pattern is constant. We remember paradise lost, and in remembering we reveal something about ourselves, something deeper than the question of whether these places were real. Something about what it means to be human in a world that feels fractured. Why do we need these stories? Not the historical truth of them. We have established that the historical truth is uncertain at best, but the psychological truth, the emotional necessity that keeps these stories alive generation after generation. Perhaps it is because fragmentation is the defining experience of being human. We are born whole, undivided, contained within a mother who provides everything. Boundaries between self and other are soft. Needs are met without asking. The world is immediate, present, all-encompassing. And then we are born, separated, divided from the source, suddenly individual, suddenly aware of boundaries, suddenly experiencing need as something that must be communicated, that might not be met, that reveals our separateness from what we depend on. This is the first loss, the loss of unity, of wholeness, of the undivided state where self and world were continuous, and we spend the rest of our lives trying to return to it. Not literally to the womb, though some psychological theories suggest that, but to the feeling of wholeness, to the experience of not being separate, to the state where boundaries dissolve and we are part of something larger than our individual selves. The lost lands give form to this longing. They provide a mythic representation of the wholeness we feel we have lost. They tell us, once the world was not divided, once we were connected, once there was a place where separation had not yet fractured reality into the isolated pieces we now inhabit, and that place sank, not through our fault, not always, but through forces larger than us, through the slow movement of the earth, through the rising of waters, through processes we could not control and cannot reverse. The sinking is important. It means the loss is not our responsibility. We did not choose fragmentation. We did not create separation. It happened to us. The world changed, and we are living with the consequences. This absolves us while acknowledging the pain. We can grieve the loss without needing to fix it. We can long for return without needing to feel guilty for leaving. We can carry the memory of wholeness without needing to explain why we no longer experience it. The lost land did not disappear because we were unworthy. It disappeared because the earth moves, because water rises, because change is fundamental to the nature of reality. And we, scattered survivors, carry fragments. This is another function of the stories. They explain why we feel incomplete, why different cultures separated by vast distances share similarities. They are all pieces of something that was once whole. Why we sense connections we cannot verify. They are remnants of actual connections that existed before the fragmenting. Lemuria becomes the answer to the question, why do I feel like something is missing? Because something is missing. Because we used to be part of a continuous whole, and now we are isolated parts. Because the world was once arranged differently, and that arrangement allowed for a kind of connection we no longer have access to. The story says, your sense of loss is valid. It is not paranoia or nostalgia or inability to accept the present. It is memory, ancient memory, memory of a time before division. And in validating the feeling, the story provides comfort. Even though we cannot return to the lost land, even though it is submerged beyond recovery, even though the wholeness it represents is unreachable, the fact that it existed, or might have existed, means the wholeness is real, was real, is not just fantasy or delusion or inability to cope with reality. We are not imagining the feeling of loss. We are remembering it. This is why we return to these stories, not because they offer solutions, not because they promise we can rebuild what was lost, but because they acknowledge the loss. They say, yes, this feeling you have is real. Yes, the world was once different. Yes, you are living in the aftermath, and there is peace in acknowledgement. The peace of having your experience validated, of knowing you are not alone in feeling that something essential is missing, of understanding that fragmentation is not personal failure, but collective condition. Everyone feels this. Every culture tells stories of lost lands. Every tradition remembers a golden age. Every mythology includes a fall from grace, an exile from paradise, a separation from the source. The details differ, but the pattern is universal, because the pattern reflects something fundamental about human consciousness, about what it means to be self-aware, to experience yourself as separate from the world, to live in a body that has clear boundaries, to be born, to grow, to die as an individual rather than as part of an undifferentiated whole. This is the human condition. And the lost lands are how we tell ourselves about the human condition, how we make sense of separation, How we explain why connection feels like what we are missing, and isolation feels like where we have ended up. Lemuria, then, is not just a place, it is a symbol of unity, of the state before fragmentation, of wholeness that was lost not through moral failing, but through the simple fact of existing in time, in a world that changes, in bodies that separate us from each other and from the earth. And we return to it in imagination, because imagination is the only place where reunion is possible. We cannot walk back across the land bridges. They are gone, covered by water, transformed into ocean floor. But we can remember them. We can tell stories about them. We can drift in our thoughts toward the idea of them. We can feel in the telling and the listening a kind of return, not literal return, but the feeling of it, the sense of moving back toward wholeness, of reversing in imagination the fragmentation we experience in reality. And this feeling matters. Even if Lemuria never existed, even if the stories are entirely mythic, even if the lost land is pure symbol with no historical reference, the feeling of return matters because the feeling of fragmentation is real. We are separated from each other, from the earth, from whatever unity consciousness might have experienced before self-awareness created the illusion of isolated selfhood. And the stories give us a way to acknowledge this separation while holding the possibility that it is not permanent, that what was divided can be reunited, that the fragments scattered by the sinking of Lemuria are still, in some sense, part of the whole they came from. This is why we return to lost lands, not because we believe we can find them, not because we think we can rebuild them, but because returning in story is the way we process loss, the way we hold memory, the way we keep alive the possibility of wholeness even while living in fragmentation. The ocean, beneath us, holds the lost land without difficulty. It does not need to understand why humans tell these stories. It simply continues its work of covering and transforming and holding whatever rests beneath its surface. And we, floating above, understand finally what we have been seeking, not the place itself, but permission to feel what we feel, permission to acknowledge loss without needing to fix it, permission to long for wholeness without needing to achieve it, permission to carry the memory of connection even while living in separation. Lemuria gives us this permission, not by being probable, not by being recoverable, but by being remembered, by existing as story, by providing a shape for feelings that would otherwise remain shapeless. And perhaps this is what all lost lands do. They hold our longing. They give form to our grief. They say, yes, something was lost. No, you cannot get it back, but you can remember. You can tell stories. You can drift in imagination toward what is no longer reachable in reality. And in that drift, you can find not reunion, but rest. The rest that comes from acknowledging loss. The rest that comes from accepting that some things, once lost, remain lost. The rest that comes from understanding that wholeness might not be a place we return to, but a memory we carry. And carrying the memory is enough. The ocean breathes beneath us, slowly, deeply, with the rhythm that has continued since before any land was called Lemuria, since before any continent rose or sank, since before the first human looked at water and wondered what lay beneath. We have drifted far tonight. Not in distance. We are perhaps exactly where we began, held by currents we cannot see, moving in patterns we do not control, but in depth, through layers of story and symbol, and the quiet spaces between them, through Lemuria, or through what Lemuria represents, or through the feeling that remains when the place itself has dissolved so completely that place and feeling are no longer separable. The water is calm, dark in a way that makes darkness feel like presence rather than absence. The kind of dark that exists not because light is missing, but because depth is complete, because we have descended below the level where light penetrates, below the surface concerns of proof and evidence, below the need to know for certain. Down here in the deep quiet, only feeling remains, the feeling of something lost, something ancient, something that existed before the world broke into the pieces we recognize, before the continents separated, before the ocean claimed territory. There used to be land. Lemuria rests here, not as a place, not anymore, but as memory held by water, as absence that has its own weight, as the space where connection used to be before connection became impossible, and we rest here with it, not searching now, not trying to prove or disprove or verify, not building theories or examining evidence or drawing conclusions, just floating, just breathing with the water's breathing, just allowing the night to deepen into the space where consciousness loosens its grip and sleep approaches like a tide that has been coming all along. There are no answers here, only the patient movement of water, only the sense that beneath us, far below where light or thought can reach, something's there, has always been there, will always be there in the same way that loss is always there. Once loss has occurred, Lemuria is that loss, the loss of wholeness, of connection, of the world before it fragmented into the difficult pieces we inhabit now. And we carry that loss not as burden but as memory, as the knowledge that what is divided was once continuous, that what is separate was once whole, that the ocean covering the space between shores once was the shore itself. The boundaries are softening now, between water and air, between sleep and waking, between the story we have been following and the silence that the story disappears into. We are dissolving, not literally, but in the way that mattering dissolves when you stop holding onto it so tightly, when you release the need to understand and simply allow yourself to be present with not understanding. Lemuria is dissolving too, from place into symbol, from symbol into feeling, from feeling into the quiet that exists beneath feeling, when feeling has exhausted itself. The ocean asks nothing of this dissolution. It simply continues, moving in rhythms older than language, deeper than thought, more patient than any human concept of patience. And in that continuation, there is permission to stop trying, to stop searching, to stop holding questions that will never be answered in the way we want them answered. Permission to simply drift, to let the water carry what needs carrying, to let the night hold what needs holding, to let the slow transition from waking to sleeping happen without resistance. The voyage is ending or continuing. It is hard to tell the difference now, hard to distinguish between movement and stillness, when both feel like surrendered to something larger. We came here seeking Lemuria. We found not a place but a reflection, not answers but the understanding that some questions exist to be held rather than solved, that some losses are meant to remain losses, that some memories serve us better as memories than they ever would as recovered realities. Lemuria taught us this, not through evidence, not through proof, but through the act of drifting toward it, and finding that the drifting itself was what mattered, that the approach was the destination, that seeking the lost land taught us something about loss that no finding could have taught. The water grows darker still. Or perhaps our eyes are closing. Perhaps we have finally released into the sleep that has been waiting all along, the sleep that does not distinguish between myth and reality, that holds all stories equally, that dissolves all certainties into the soft, indefinite space where dreaming begins. In that space, Lemuria still exists, not as continent or archipelago or specific geographical location, but as the feeling we drift through in the moments between thoughts, as the memory we carry without knowing we are carrying it, as the sense that something vast and ancient rests beneath us, not waiting to be found, but simply resting. And we rest with it. The ocean moves. The night completes itself. And somewhere in the movement, in the completion, in the slow rhythm that asks nothing and offers everything, we find we have arrived, not at Lemuria, but at the understanding that Lemuria was never the destination. The ocean was the destination. The drift was the destination. The slow releasing of the need to know was the destination. And here we are, held by water, covered by darkness, breathing in rhythm with something older than ourselves, the lost land beneath us, the patient ocean around us, the long night continuing, without urgency, without conclusion, without any need for the voyage to end, because the voyage and the arrival are the same thing. We are here. We have always been here, floating in the space where Lemuria was, or might have been, or exists now only as the shape of absence, and the absence holds us, gently, completely. The way water holds everything that releases into it, the way sleep holds everything that stops resisting it, the way the ocean holds the memory of every shore it has ever covered, without effort, without end, just continuing, the breath, the rhythm, the slow dissolving of all that was solid into all that is liquid, into all that is rest, into all that is night, into all that remains when the voyage completes itself not by arriving but by simply being here, in this moment, in this water, in this darkness that is both everywhere and nowhere. Lemuria. Not a place anymore, just a feeling, just a name for the space we drift through, just the ocean breathing, and us breathing with it, until there is no difference, until there is only the breathing, only the water, only the long, patient, endless continuation of the night.